Hi there. So recently I've been making the mistake of browsing Reddit, which is probably the worst thing you can do for your mental health if you're someone who actually thinks about things before you write or has done any research into things like history or really on anything, because Reddit is full of urban, young, super atheist, nihilist, disconnected, terminally online people who constantly spout the most absurd nonsense and takes that they heard from other people but have never done any research into themselves as if they're their own takes, and then they think themselves smart. And because of the stupid social credit upvote downvote system, they aggressively pile on to anyone who actually offers a nuanced take because a nuanced take challenges their own ignorance. But that aside, specifically, there was a post where people were talking about this woman who knocked down people's Halloween decorations. Honestly, she looked quite mentally ill. And then some people decided, with no context, that she must have been religious and been knocking down Halloween decorations because of that. And then I simply said something like, well, that's quite biased and a big assumption. And I know you guys are American, so like people have a certain perception of religion there, but most people are religious. And so to call religion mental illness, which they did, is pretty biased and silly. Well, that got downvoted into oblivion because, again, didn't just like agree with the herd think. And also people started replying with their incredible takes on religion, all the classic stuff. There was a lot, but one of them that I want to talk about is that religion caused most wars in history, especially Christianity, which has to be the most like midwit divining rod kind of statement ever. If someone says that they heard that from a teacher or from a friend or whatever, and they repeat it and feel very smart, when really it's incredibly reductive and, again, quite a midwit take. Because the implications of that is that sans religion, or in the absence of religion, wars would not have occurred at the same frequency or severity that they did. And that's just been proven wrong in history, especially in the 20th century. I don't need to mention that the USSR, Germany in World War II, their motivations for fighting were not religious. Okay, so the same impulses, having like in-groups, out-groups, resources, territory, all still occur, and the reasons for fighting based on those impulses still occur in the absence of religion. You'd think that us being in the 21st century would make us more aware of that and people would be less ignorant about this, but unfortunately, ignorance, just like all those reasons for fighting, is human nature and something that just continues very stubbornly. I wanted to talk about maybe the greatest midwit war example of religion causing wars, the Crusades, a war that very few people have done any actual research into or put any effort into understanding, but very many people have very strong opinions on because they think it makes them seem very progressive and smart, and they think themselves above humans in history, and they think themselves more intelligent than the learned men of medieval Europe, medieval Arabia, whatever, who honestly probably had more intelligence in their pinky finger than most of these Reddits can muster in their entire body. But that's besides the point. I just wanted to talk as an example, a proving example of what I'm talking about, the First Crusade. So the First Crusade, the reason it's important to talk about versus the myriad afterwards is because the First Crusade set the tone and the circumstances that allowed the future Crusades to occur. And so it's the most key one to talk about in the context of why the Crusades occurred. And I have this really cool website up. It's an interactive world history map. And I'm looking here roughly 29 years before the First Crusade in 1070 AD. And I want you to take a look at specifically Byzantium, which is not what they would have called themselves, Eastern Rome, so I'll call them Eastern Rome. I want you to take a look at Eastern Rome here. Look at those gorgeous borders. Very chunky, to use a Reddit term. Now, in this situation, you can see that bordered to the west, they have a Muslim Khanate and the Christian kingdoms up here. And in the east, they have a series of Muslim caliphates and a single Christian kingdom right here in the Kingdom of Georgia, which only shares a very small border with them. Now, if I go a little bit further back, you'll see that Byzantium, Eastern Rome, has been in territory retreat. I'm going to shrink myself a bit here so I can access more of the timeline. Has been in territory retreat for a long time. They've been losing land. I have to go a fair bit back to where they lost the majority of it to the Abbasids. They've been losing land for quite a time period now, and this is something that wouldn't be lost on anyone in the ancient world. Come on, Shrinker. Well, we might have to just move me over here. I'm going to do that. This would be a topic of conversation and something that people would be aware of, that Byzantium has been under siege, and people used to have longer memories, so if something's a few centuries back, that would be considered quite relevant to people. Just like if you look today or talk to Orthodox people today, Muslim people today, they very often have more extensive memories of history than these same modern Western basement dweller types, or even non-basement dweller type Westerners. Maybe it's the effects of the Industrial Revolution, development, and just kind of focusing on more the individual and your own kind of life's development. But we tend to perceive history as being more distant than other cultures do. An example of this is like if you talk to an Orthodox priest about maybe how in some of the Crusades, the Venetians, for instance, sacked Constantinople. Stuff like that, when you hear them talk about it, you'll notice this emotional tinge to it, like it happened very recently, like almost like how a Redditor might talk about, Israel-Palestine or the Ukraine, wars that they have been signaled by our establishment in the news that they should really care a lot about. Whereas they ignore the majority of wars, and probably like on something like Myanmar, they have no idea what's going on with it because the news hasn't talked about it as much. So our basement-dwelling Redditor doesn't really know they're supposed to care. They haven't gotten the software update. So you'll notice that for the Orthodox, for Eastern cultures, memory is longer. That's important to realize because though, for instance, they lost the majority of their territory here to Muslim caliphates in the 600s, the 7th century, and then roughly stabilized, you can see a little bit of territory change back and forth in the following centuries. The overall sense for the Christian world would be that Byzantium, Eastern Rome, is in retreat. You can see here in the 11th century, they lose a little bit more to the Seljuks. And in the decades immediately preceding the First Crusade, we're going to see something really big happen here. Ready? They lose a massive portion of their territory on the Anatolian Peninsula. Okay, roughly half of their territory. This can't be ignored in the context of why the First Crusade occurred. If you ignore that and you are, as most people seem to be, completely historically ignorant of the territorial and resource changes that are happening in the area, I can see why someone's brain might think, well, Christians got upset that Muslims exist and decided to invade, when that completely is ignorant of the context of the vast territorial power changes. Power and territory and resources are actually the cause of the majority of history's wars, by the way. If you want like the shortest take from this video, not religion, power and resources. So they lose a significant portion of their very ancient territory. And what happens is the Eastern Roman Emperor makes an appeal to the Western Christian kingdoms for aid because of what's happening. And now, why do the Western Christian kingdoms end up agreeing? There's a multitude of reasons. Obviously, some of it is cultural, religious similarity to the Eastern Romans, who are currently under siege and losing a lot of their territory, and the fear that culturally less similar people might continue to get near to Europe's borders. This was a massive fear for Europeans, not in the least because the exact same thing had been playing out in Spain, as we can observe. The Visigoths were Christian, and then not too long before the First Crusade, we have the massive expansion of the Umayyads into Christian Spain. And if you'll see here, they're literally up in France, right? So power, wars, territory struggles. So this was a concern that a very similar thing would happen, that the Islamic kingdoms would, as they had shown and presented or represented themselves as being very militarily successful, they obviously were, they had very good militaries and leaders and were quite proficient at warfare. The concern was that a similar thing would happen over here. And then you'd have a very concerning situation where Europe is kind of encroached upon on two sides by cultures that, again, weren't very compatible. And that goes both ways. Both sides would be concerned about massive religious changes in their territories because religion is ultimately a way that people relate to each other. And as the 20th century showed, in absence of religion, we just find other ways. So whether it's by your socialist revolution, by your race, by your nationality, humans always find some way to group by similarity, and they get concerned when their similar group is encroached upon by groups that they perceive as not similar, because they're humans. It's human nature. It has nothing to do with religion itself. So Eastern Rome asks the Christian kingdoms for help in the West. So yes, part of why they help, because they're similar in culture. Another major part, Europe, as everyone knows, was full of wars. Interesting, eh? Kingdoms that share a religion, Catholic Christianity, are warring with each other. How bizarre. Maybe religion wasn't the reason for their wars. Maybe European kingdoms were constantly warring because of the dynastic system and because of power, control, and territory. Could be. So the Pope had an interest in directing this constant violence away from Europe, this nightly violence away from Europe, giving the European Christian kingdom something to fight for that wasn't within Christendom. Because believe it or not, the Pope often played a vital role in settling disputes and leading to peace talks between European kingdoms. And the Pope tended to be very interested in peace in Europe. That was a goal of his. And I mean, there were other efforts, like very early examples of international law forming, like the banning of crossbows, which had a mixed effect. But the Pope formed, as people who know, not just a spiritual leader, but a sort of temporal leader, like a higher court that kings would have to refer to and answer to, else face excommunication, which, yes, had spiritual consequences, but also had very real social consequences. Nobody wanted to be the excommunicated guy at the table. So the Pope had an interest in directing all that violence, all those feuds, away from Europe and into the Middle East. And so he encouraged the crusade. And what happens? So we've seen all that massive territorial loss, right? The majority of Anatolia taken. And what does the First Crusade accomplish, which to this day we are told is horrific and wrong and was unjustified and a massive incursion into kingdoms and things that were just being peaceful? This is it. A minor reconquering of southern Anatolian territories and the establishment of a very tiny kingdom of Jerusalem. The majority of the Muslim territory remains Muslim, and the Sultanate of Rome is still here. It was a defensive war, that would be the perception, after centuries and decades and centuries of territorial expansion by Muslim powers in the East. Now, again, showing that religion wasn't the motivation, politicking occurred all throughout it. Because if religion was the pure motivation, all of the ire and distrust and politicking and scheming would occur in between the religions and not within religions. But because these are powerful people who ultimately are concerned about territories, resources, prestige, and etc., there was politicking within. So unfortunately, the Crusaders promised to return all of their territory to Eastern Rome. When they conquered it, they didn't. Unfortunately, when the Crusaders got to the Holy Land, there was a ton of infighting and people splitting off to go and settle their own lands and try and take what they could for their own prestige and glory. So yeah, just like always, their wars were dominantly political and dominantly about temporal things. So I'm just totally exhausted and tired of midwit historical takes abounding, and it's, as much as it's a sign of someone being a historical midwit, that doesn't make it any more right. And unfortunately what happens is the more these things are repeated, the more they enter common consciousness, and if something's believed enough by enough people, it might as well be a fact. And that's one of the unfortunate realities of this post-truth world. And the Crusades specifically are such a great example of this, because people love to talk about it, people who have no clue about history, who haven't put any effort into it, and who are simply repeating something they heard. They love to bring it up as their little example of something that they know that is so, wow, that's such an amazing take. Crusade bad, Christian bad, very enlightened. And it's an example of a larger issue, which is that people who don't know anything like to think they do, and they repeat canned takes, and then eventually it happens enough, and kids take it on, school teachers teach it, specifically in elementary and high school, and this reductive view of history abounds, which then means we're less prepared to actually deal with our current reality, because the benefit of understanding history truthfully is that it informs us about today, right? The history book on the shelf is doomed to repeat itself. So if you think that wars are caused by religion, and you completely ignore the 20th century, and you completely ignore that ever since we were running around with loincloths on, gathering mushrooms in the woods, we've been throwing spears at each other, we've been fighting over berry bushes, you completely ignore that way before European Christians ever got to North America, there were tribes genociding each other and warring with each other. You completely ignore that it's human nature. Well, you might be at risk of thinking yourself above human nature, and then you'll be a less developed person, less intelligent, and not realize when you yourself are being ignorant, exclusionary, and potentially leading to conflict in your own life, because you think because you hold a certain set of traits or don't hold a certain set of traits or beliefs that you're somehow above human nature. Which ultimately these people, by being so ignorant, exclusionary, combative, and judgmental of something the majority of the religion takes part in, which is of the world takes part in, which is religion, are proving themselves to be absolutely human and completely given to the same tendencies as the very people they hate, because ultimately we're all human. So if you're someone who likes to tout little historical midwit takes, I really beg and plead that you actually try and delve a little deeper beyond those takes. And if you're going to talk about something passionately or bring it up to someone who does know more than you, maybe have a little bit of humility and realize that history is an actual topic of study that people spend their entire lives trying to understand. People spend their entire lives understanding just the Crusades, just World War I, just World War II. And maybe if you've literally only had YouTube Shorts, TikTok, a few Reddit takes here and there that you're now repeating, maybe recognize that you actually don't know anything. You just know what you've been told, which means you don't know anything and your understanding is zero. And instead of getting upset at people who do understand, maybe try and recognize when you're in ignorance and try and learn from people who do know better than you, or at least be open to it. Because then that's the only way to stop being a midwit. And you don't want to be a midwit, okay? Anyways, that's my rant. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.